I'm
Well,
talking the new stuff such as
you
digital.
can't do it legally because if you set if you do anything to lower the number of miles on an odometer, you're basically breaking federal law.
Even
And,
though the odometer says,
And the only reason is because we try to sell it.
yeah, I know, but some of them on the title says odometer is exempt because of age.
Well, it exceeds odometer limits, but nowadays, all of the odometers are million-mile odometers. You know what I mean? And although there was one girl that emailed me from New Mexico that was working on her Mustang, whatever your model was, and she said it had 1.5 million miles on it, and she had an evaporative code. I mean, literally, that's what she said. It's got 1.5 million miles on it. Is what she. Now did not see this car, but that wasn't even the focus of her email. She was saying my evaporative system is not working right, and I'm getting codes for that. And all, and she was saying, and I said, how many miles I got? Oh, it's got 1.5 million miles.
You reckon maybe she meant to put 150,000?
I don't know. That wasn't the way her email read, but whatever happens, I'm not gonna, go after the rest of that. But chasing the dead speedometer needle is what we're doing today, and I got some other speedometer stories I can tell you. The work order, this pickup right here, this is the actual truck, and it had 98,350 miles on it. Speedometer was inoperative. Overdrive light flashing, check engine light owned. Okay, so we've got an overdrive light flashing, we've got a check engine light on, and we've got an inoperative speedometer.
The overdrive light flashing is a transmission going into safe mode and it's raising the pressure.
Yeah, if it doesn't know that it flashes, it'll flash the overdrive light for a bunch of reasons. But if it has the idea that the transmission is trying to slip a little bit, even if the torque converter is slipping, it will raise the pressures and start flashing the overdrive light, and when it shifts, it'll jerk a quick gear neck.
Yeah.
Uh,
That happened on that river.
Yeah. Well, this was a high mileage pickup with 3 mildly alarming problems. A knowledgeable glance at the repair order indicated all 3 of them were closely related. Well, you had an inoperative speedometer, overdrive light, check engine light. We already talked about that. Now, in the old days, and this is what McBride was talking about, if an unscrupulous vehicle owner wanted to rack up a few thousand unrecorded miles, he just disconnected his speedometer cable and drove around not knowing how fast they were going for a while. Now, let me ask you this. Let's say that you get an instrument cluster, a speedometer concern, where the speedometer needle is reading just fine, but the odometer is not reading.
What vehicle we talking about?
Doesn't matter if the speedometer needle's working, but your odometer reading's not changing.
I wouldn't complain.
I know, but the people are wanting you to fix it because
Yeah.
you're a shop and not a shyster. Oh, what is it? Huh?
I have no idea.
Has to be the instrument cluster. Nothing else
Well,
it
how
can
does
be.
it know, something that's got a tell it?
There's little gears in there that drive the little wheels that operate your, and if that little gear is busted, which happens a lot, you'll get good, because the needle works fine, but you won't rack up any miles.
What's driving the gears?
Yeah. The gears are actually driven by the same thing that's driving, like if it was a cable driven, it's actually driven by another gear. But I've seen a bunch of them that have just little plastic gears, and a tooth will bust off that little gear, kind of like it does in our climate control actuators, and the needle's still working. And you know how a speedometer works, the ones that's got this cable driven, you know how they work, what makes them work right? They basically have a little drum, and the magnet, the needle is spring loaded to the 0 position with a real weak clock spring looking thing. And so that little drum is basically connected to the needle. The shaft of the needle is connected to this drum, and it's a little drum on the ones I've seen about that big around. Okay, inside that drum, not touching it, but in the center of this, there's a little magnet. In the center of that magnet is a little bronze bushing in there, and that little needle shaft sits in that bronze bushing. And as you spin this magnet, that little drum is made out of ferrous metal, and it tries to follow that magnet, and it pulls it against it. And then when you slow down, the spring pulls the speedometer needle back to 0. That's how that works. Typically, it's not that complicated, really. Now, later on, they've got little servo motors and all that are driven by by amps. I took a part of a speedometer apart one time that had that little thing that drove the needle, and I could hook it up to a fob battery, and it would pull it around. And I actually got a good battery and did that, and when it pulled it around, I made a mark there. And then when I was checking a fob battery, I'd check it with that. If it didn't go up to that mark, I'd say, well, we have a battery checker here, you know, and I'd build up a speedometer. But anyway, it wasn't illegal. Now, that's the people that were resetting the mileage. It wasn't illegal to reset the mileage, but there's a reason for it. One time there was a guy that had a speedometer that needed to be replaced on his Explorer. And so my cohort over there popped a speedometer in it and threw it out on the yard. You know, done with it. Speedometer worked fine. I don't know if it was making noise or something. And see the red numbers on that where the yellow arrow indicates the red numbers? That's, if you see red numbers, a red 10th digit, that means the speedometer's been replaced. Well, as soon as that guy got in his vehicle, he wheeled it around to the used car department. And he says, what are these red numbers? What have these red numbers done to my trade-in value? And the used car guy says, you've lost about 25% of your trade-in value right now because you got red numbers on your speedometer. Because your speedometer's been replaced and it's an unknown how much miles on it. And so he came back in there and he says, can we fix this somehow? He says, I don't want to lose my trade-in value because of course the guy that put the speedometer on it copped an attitude. He goes, I'm not fixing nothing. I've already done my work and I'm not getting paid to and all this kind of stuff. And so whenever he got through chewing on their ear and fussing at them, they came over and says, can you help us with this? And I said, sure, not a problem. So I pulled the speedometer out and I basically took the little wheel out of the original speedometer that had the black numbers on it and I dropped them in there. So he'd have black numbers. Further, he had his original miles. Got it? Now some of the guys used to take all this little wheels apart and set the miles like they were supposed to be. You know, and I would figure that we'll be better off if we don't have red numbers. You know, so I would just drop the original drum in there because typically there wasn't ever a problem with that. And so one day the service manager, the shop foreman came over there and he goes, I don't know if we ought to be resetting these speedometers because we got a sticker we can put on the door. And I said, well, Philip, you know it's a breach of federal law to let it out with less miles than it came in. And what if they peel the sticker off? You think they're going to admit to that if something happens? And then he said, I'm talking about these blankety black speedometers. And he wandered off around the shop, you know, way off out there. And then he said something really ugly to me when he came back in there. But the simple fact was, if you put that little sticker on the door saying the speedometer was changing this many miles, and they decide to peel it off, which they can do that with a little razor blade, you know what I'm saying? They don't have to leave it on there. And who's going to get in trouble? They're going to say, there was no sticker on here, you know, that's what I'm saying. Whatever, just, you know, talking hypothetical. All right, so this is what it looks like taking a speedometer apart. Now, the reason I was taking this speedometer apart, and by the way, some yo-yo from the other side of the shop that was a fast service guy came walking over there when he saw that I had a speedometer apart one day, and he goes, what are you doing? I said, I'm setting the miles on this speedometer. He goes, really? And I said, I said, there's not a shop manual procedure for it. But they'll tell you in the shop manual, we're not going to tell you how to do it, but you better not let a vehicle out with fewer miles than it came in. I mean, you know, they're putting you in the rock and hard place. What do you do it? He says, well, can you teach me how to do that? And I said, why do you want to know? What are you going to do with that information? And they didn't want to talk about that. You know, he's going to take his car and run the miles back like somebody else was talking about. Who was talking about that in here?
Just take the cable
Bad.
out and put it.
But anyway, what I did was, this is the way I did it on these Tauruses. And what would happen on these Tauruses was the speedometer needle would just bounce, bounce, bounce when you're just driving along at a lower speed. Because that little shaft, see that little drum I was talking about? And it rode in here. See that little thing spins and it would try to pull that drum around with it and that'd pull the needle against the spring. Well, what I did was I had this little thing here that was originally made to take apart Renault CV axles. You know, with a little tool, you make a little fork tool. And I found out I could take this little fork screwdriver tool I made and put it under that needle and just apply gentle pressure and that needle would pop off of that shaft. Just pop off, because it's just a kind of an interference kit anyway. All right, and then I would take the front, once you get the needle off, you can take the front off of here, and then you can take the guts off of this thing, and I would actually replace this take this out of this speedometer and put it in the other one, which is totally legal, totally above board, nothing wrong with it. And the customer's happier because their miles haven't changed, right? And they don't have red numbers. All right, when I pull this apart, I would see this little dry bronze bushing in here was trying to catch on that little needle right there, and it was causing the needle to bounce. Well, this speedometer, if you buy one, is $500, you know, at the time. So anyway, what I would do is just take a drop of motor oil, one little drop of motor oil and put in there. And so that little needle for the rest of its life was swimming in motor oil, and it never gave that trouble again. And I told him, and now, this is the important part, when you're putting the needle back on, what if you put it on so that it ain't pointing in the right place? That's gonna be a problem, isn't it? Well, you notice this little mark right here? When I put that little needle back on so it's pointing at that mark, when I put it back on there, when that shaft is at rest, I go tap, 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 tap to make sure it's on there good, and then I would pick it up and set it over that post, and it would always be accurate. Got that? Nothing to it. That's a little speedometer repair. This was something I actually wrote up to send to the magazine one time, and I never sent it to them. And I think they were kind of scared that if I did send it, if they did publish it, that somebody would use this information to, you know, Jimmy there, to do the McBride thing and, you know, screw up the mileage, you know. All right. Well, this F-150 was already a high mileage vehicle and nothing had been disconnected, but the speedo was completely dead. This was not moving and this was not moving. All right, so we had a needle down, 98,350 miles. Now on this one here, the PCM received its speed signal directly from the speed sensor, as does the cruise control. Right, now this particular, you gotta know how this works, because it changes from year to year. All right, the PCM depends on the speed signal for transmission shift strategy, and since the PCM promptly illuminated the check engine light and started flashing the overdrive light, the signal obviously wasn't present there. There was no signal there. Related symptom was that the cruise control didn't work either. What if the cruise control did work, but the speedometer and the overdrive light was flashing?
What all is it looking at to see, to tell that light flash?
Oh my goodness, there's lots of codes. I mean, not just one thing.
Other
You know, it's like anything else. That's like saying, why is my check engine light coming?
Other than directly concerned with the transmission.
Well, if you're talking the check engine light or the overdrive light?
Overdrive light.
The overdrive light's looking at anything that it detects that the transmission's doing in the way of slippage or bad, pressure switches or whatever. All right, now, this is the way this thing was, the vehicle speed sensor, this particular one. You notice this, we basically have got this, it's little vehicle spinners mounted on one side, and that signal goes into this solid state instrument cluster, which is just about like this one I was waving around earlier. That one right there. That instrument cluster right there is what I'm talking about, in case you're wondering. It's like a, all right, so, and on the back of it, you notice there's absolutely no speedometer cable going to it. All right, so there's a little microprocessor in there, electronic speedometer, odometer, then you got all this other stuff going on. And I've got a little picture of this down here. That's your vehicle speed sensor. And where is that at? That's on the back of the transmission on this one, on the output, right? Which is the oldest place. That's where cruise control originally had their speed sensors before anything else needed to know how fast the car was going except cruise. That was the speed sensor they used. The PCM receives its speed signal directly from the speed sensor, as does the cruise. All right, so basically, when you see these dotted lines right here, see the dotted lines? That means that this is going other places that's not illustrated on this schematic. See what I mean? Anytime you see a dotted line, that means there's more to this than what you're seeing. Well, see this? You got the same thing going on right here. See the dashed line means the wiring signal goes other places. That's what I was talking about right there. When you see one that's drawn that way. All right, you notice none of these other lines. Well, that one's dotted too, which means that goes other places besides there too. So there's more wires coming off of that splice than that right there. Anyway, it illuminated the check engine light, started flashing the overdrive light, both of those being caused by the same thing. The signal wasn't present there, and so here we go. Any effective repair of an electronic speedometer concern demands an understanding of the stuff behind the dash and under the truck. If you don't understand where the signals are coming from, you're going to get in some really hot water. Okay? And you basically, you can change parts that you thought was what was wrong and find out, no, I was working on the wrong part and it wasn't that one, it was this sensor here and I feel like a dummy now and all that. So you got to know your sensors, which does what and on which truck. Now this one here that's on the rear end, what do you typically associate that with? What is it there for?
It's a speed sensor. I know on that Ranger and the years is a speed sensor.
Okay. But you got one, this particular truck had one back there, and it had this one.
Says race.
Huh?
Where's the other one at?
This one's on the extension, I mean, on the output shaft on the transmission.
I'm gonna say that one is, Although one of the transmission is looking at your transmission, ratio and all that, and one of the rear end is your active
Well, this
speed.
one here is basically measuring how fast the output shaft is turning.
Yeah.
The drive shaft is turning, it's measuring that. This is measuring the speed of the differential, and this is measuring the speed of the output shaft on the transmission. They can use either one of them, they've just got to do the math whenever they type their algorithm, because both of them are doing it. Now that one there, typically the ABS system uses that one.
So if you have one of them unplugged, your odometer's not gonna work.
And your speedometer won't either. You won't be able to tell how fast you're going, and you'll get multiple tickets, and then they'll say, what? Can I look in here and tell that your speedometer's not working?
You got
Okay,
GPS.
feds, we need to get these guys over here, this guy's breaking federal law, and you get carried off by the collar, and the little girls get raised by their grandparents.
You got the speed on your GPS?
Yeah. Yeah, I know, but that's probably, the GPS also knows that you unhooked it too, because it's watching that. The camera on your phone, it will look at your speedometer, okay? All right, now right here, you got this other speed sensor here, see that one there? See how that's wired up? Look, now this right here is a different system. And the differential, now this is not the same truck, right? Okay, so you got a vehicle speed sensor in there, and it's wired to the speed control, and it's wired to the rear air suspension module, and it's wired to the instrument cluster, and the GEM module has to know about it. See, that's a different outfit. So if you've got a truck you think is wired up like this, and it's wired up like the one we're actually working on, you got issues. All right, so you gotta understand this. Now, 92 to 96, a programmable speedometer odometer modules got their speed information from back here. There were some other ones after the one that we're talking about, we're working on here, where the speed signal came from the rear end into the ABS module. The ABS module aligned it, defined it, and sent it out to the cruise and the PCM and the instrument cluster.
So if you had a bad ABS model, you wouldn't have.
Exactly. If the ABS module's asleep, your speedometer's gonna be dead. But not on this truck, not on the truck we're working on. See how you gotta say, let's go to look at description and operation and find out how this particular truck is wired up. That's a really important thing. All right. Now the sensor was hardwired to the ABS module on those, and the RABS module and the differential speed sensor. You remember that little connector everybody's always asking me about that's there on the master cylinder on the Ranger? That's this connector right here, so you can check that. It's a data link connector, so you can hook up to it with your meter and see if you're reading anything from back there. These little sensors cost about $12, and they go bad all the time. All right, on PSOM systems, which is like that programmable speedometer odometer module, you would if let's say that you put bigger tires on your truck. Now, in the olden days, when you put bigger tires on your truck, you could change the little gear, the little plastic gear in there, and put it one with a different number of teeth. You put one with fewer teeth, it would read faster. You put one with less teeth, it would read slower. Now, when I put those 275 gears in my old 74 F100 that I was driving, I went to get this guy that was broke down, that was a friend of mine. He was actually my roommate. He had this Chevy Vega that a water pump went out on the way back from Alabama, and I drove over to the other side of Lake Charles to take him back to Port Arthur. And had my truck, you know, I just hadn't even thought about the speedometer. I was just driving it according to what the speedometer said. And I had him behind me, pulling him with a rope, coming through Lake Charles. And if you've ever been through Lake Charles on the interstate curves going through Lake Charles a lot more, and he's on this little Vega behind me back there, and he's looking at the real speed that we're going, and I'm driving like I would, and my speedometer's saying 60, 65 miles an hour. And when we finally got parked, he says, man, you were scaring the daylights out of me. He said, I was going 85 miles an hour, and I was going into a power slide with no engine back there. I didn't know I was pulling him that fast. Anyway, you could actually ground a connector over here to the dash that said PSOM on it, and then you could use this little thing to set. There were like 1,100 different programs, and you could set that thing so that you had to do your roll it, you know, the number of rolls per mile, and you had to set it up so that it would be accurate. You could only do the early ones, like the 92 and 93s, 3 times before they wouldn't let you change them anymore. You could do the 96 one 6 times. Most people don't even know that, that's the way it was. But this is what we got right here, the 97 model. All right, now, there's your little driven gear, and there's your drive gear. See, the drive gear doesn't really look like it on there, but it's a plastic gear that slides over there, a little ball in a drilled out place, and it slides over that. It's got a little cutout. And so there have been times when I would reach up in that hole whenever we didn't have any speed operation, and I would move that gear, and it would just wiggle back and forth, and I'd say, this thing's just spinning around in there. And I've actually seen on some of the governor gears on some of these Escorts where it would wear out because that drive gear down on the final drive would lose. That's another story. I still got the differential speed sensor in the rear axle for ABS, but on this one, the speedometer is driven by this one. In the olden days, a cable went in here, but then they also had this on those, reading that, but they just figured, well, why don't we just use this and drive that speedometer with that? All right. Now by 1999, the four-wheel anti-lock brake, see the differential speed sensor went into there, and then it took that signal out to everything else it needed. So it only had that one sensor on there. Now in the front it had wheel speed sensors and all that. The scan tool threw me a PO500, which was just what I expected. Quick look at the live data display showed a 0 reading for the vehicle speed sensor. The check engine light and the flash and overdrive indicator generally indicate a problem has arisen that affects both fuel emission strategy and transmission strategy. And so it needs to know vehicle speed for transmission shift, and it does some pretty interesting things with the fuel and emission system based on vehicle speed too. As a matter of fact, if you got to going too fast, it would start killing injectors to slow you down. Because why does it not want you going really, really fast? The tires can't handle the speed. When you get past a certain speed, the tires on a pickup, like the one that most people are driving, will come all to pieces. And if those tires come all to pieces and you're going 130 miles an hour, then you're a dead man. That's just all there is to it. So whenever you hit where that thing has been speed limited to, it's going to go, and it's going to throw a P1270 code. One time somebody bought a Bronco brand new, headed off up there to about like a 95 or 96 model, and they headed off for Ozark on it. They came back and they immediately wanted out of the deal, even though they'd already signed the paper and bought the truck, because the check engine light was on. So when we checked the check engine light, it said it was a P1270 code, which meant as soon as they got out on the road, they had just floored it to see how fast it would go. They didn't hurt it, but they thought they had, and they were wanting somebody else to have that problem. We saw that P1270 code, they were busted. They drove away, still the proud owners of a Bronco that had had the check engine light reset on it. Okay. All right, the PCM will shut the injector down if it's driven above a certain speed, and the OBD, also the OBD part of the program uses the speed signal to time its drive cycle test, right? So the visual inspection came next. So the speedometer was the only part of the cluster that was inoperative, and it shares a fuse with other components, and they all work. So here's the speed sensor right here. That's the way it looked on that vehicle. Somebody had a tie wrap on it too, you know. And sometimes a dog or a rat will chew on the wires. You look under there, you're gonna see animal damage, and you'll see where a squirrel built a nest under the hood. And one time I pulled one, opened the hood, and I saw a bird nest there with eggs in it and all that. I mean, and the vehicle wasn't parked a whole lot, you know. But everything was good. The pins were clean and tight on their terminals. We were fine. We pulled the speed sensor, and I made a visual inspection by sticking my finger in that hole and feeling of that gear. There's nothing in there that's gonna bite you, so just stick your finger in there and feel of the gear. And see if they're wore out. Sometimes that gear will crack. It'll bust or something, right? All right. It's got a fairly intricate little microprocessor, but there wasn't much I could do with that. But I wanted to know whether the sensor was actually generating the speed signal and whether the signal was reaching the cluster connector or not. Get my meter, and I'm going to pull the dash off. Now, on these old trucks here, and you'll have some others that look like this but don't work like that. What you do is you pull that, you turn that lights on, pull that out and turn on your fog lights. Stick a screwdriver in there, pull that knob off, turn it over, and then whenever you turn the knob with it turned over, it releases a little latch, and you just pull that switch right out of the dash. That's pretty cool, isn't it? That came out in '87. See how that? Turn the knob, pull the knob off, turn it around, turn it, and pull it out, right?
What vehicle is that, Mr. Richard?
Huh?
What vehicle is this?
That's a '97 F-150, '97, '98. Yeah. Now, there came a time where the light switch still looked like that, but you didn't have to take it off that way, so they all wanted them to look universal. I connected my digital voltmeter to the gray-black wire leading to the cluster and clicked over to DC volts. Now see this right here, that's a zoom in on that. See that wire? That's the one I was going into. It looks like I'm going into that wire down there, but I was actually making contact with that gray wire with the black stripe. That's the one that typically, and there's my DeWalt drill down there, which I eventually, my helper burned that up by using it for an impact wrench or something. But anyway, now sometimes the fuse panel junction box will go bad and start bleeding voltage from other circuits, and that'll kill it. And was there a signal at the cluster? And this is what I picked up with my $350 ET332 Mac meter that they don't make anymore. All right, and I had it spinning, I was checking it, I had 3.5 volts right there. AC volts now is what I was checking. And I ran it, I could have, connected an oscilloscope, but I saw all I needed to see. Well, you know what happened? I reconnected the cluster and rechecked the speedometer operation, and it all started working. You know what I did when I disconnected it and plugged it back in? The same thing that I would do on the Chryslers when I take the battery cables off and touch them together. Oh, I didn't know about that back then. But I rebooted it. And that's not the first time I'd seen that. I've seen other little modules that we'd reboot. You know, about like a little monitor module, like on some Eagle Premiers and stuff. It would say, they say monitor on there, and they'll tell you if anything's wrong with your wall or your whatever, instead of having a bunch of warning lights. They had that one little box, and it would just have gibberish on it. And I'd unplug it, plug it back in, it would wake up and do just fine. The air conditioner display would start doing screwy things, and you could unplug it, plug it back in, and you're rebooting the little computer in there. All right, so the speedometer might work just fine from now on. It might quit before the customer got out of the parking lot, no matter how far I drove it to verify the repair, but they chose to pay for the diagnosis and they drove away happy. I could have rebooted it, maybe. Could I have by disconnecting the battery cables? I don't know. But in that particular case. Now, there's this one guy that I put to work at a dealership close by here, and he drew problem with instrument cluster needles going crazy on a Chevy pickup. And he says he checked all the fuses, didn't see anything. So he went and looked up technical service bulletins because he was working at the dealership, and he found out that you could reflash the engine controller and fix that. So he plugged in the Tech 2 and he reflashed the engine controller, and the gauges came alive. Well, somebody else got smart and says, well, there's just one fuse, and I don't remember which one it is, that you can unplug and plug back in and fix the cluster too. Well, when he turned it in and told the service manager what he did, the service manager says, I'm so glad I gave that truck to you, because 6 other trucks like that came in this week, and every other mechanic except you replaced the instrument cluster for that problem. Now, it fixed it, but it wasn't necessary to replace the cluster. See what I'm saying? Because obviously put the cluster in there, it will work. They say everybody else has been to plug the cluster in, you fixed one by just reflashing. You know what I mean? So think about that. Who's the smart guy? You know what I mean? The one that does that. Anybody got any questions or comments?
So, when you're at a dealership,
Yep.
basically, it's just you. Basically, a customer will come in, give you a problem, and it's just you. No matter how.
They have a service
Nope.
rider.
The way that
Service
works,
rider, what?
the service writer talks to the customer. They write down what it is the customer's complaining about. And a bigger dealership will have a dispatcher that will take those tickets, and they'll say, Zach does this kind of work, James does that kind of work, McBride does this kind of work, and he'll say, okay, this is the work like Zach usually does. And Zach, come to the dispatch office. Zach, come to the dispatch office. So you go up there and he hands you the ticket, clocks you in on it, or you clock yourself in on it if it works that way, and then you go find out what's wrong. You do your troubleshooting by yourself. Typically, you find out what's wrong, and then you go to the service writer. If you don't have enough information, you say, I need to know more about this because you didn't tell me everything I needed to know. And so he says, then whenever the service manager, the service writer calls the customer and says, oh yeah, well it only does it at 45 miles an hour on rainy days when I'm going up this hill over here in Ozark, right? See, I mean, that's that kind of thing. So anyway, you tell the service, it needs this, this, and this. And it's going to cost this much money, you know, and they'll typically do the labor. Now, when I was at the Ford place over there, I would quote the labor because I knew what the labor was, and I was always fair. You know what I mean? Every now and then, if you let some yo-yos quote the labor, they'll want to charge 15 hours for replacing 2 fuses. You know, I ain't gonna play that game. So it was like, you know, an hour for checking it, and for another repair, the repair was like a half an hour. But typically, we were through with the repairs in 15 minutes. But anyway, that's what I'm talking about. You are in a small dealership now, or in some of the bigger dealerships, if they will allow it, the customer will come talk to you, you know. But a lot of the times they don't want the mechanic talking to the customer because the customer will ask questions to trip up a young mechanic. Like I had one guy that said, if this was your truck, what would you do to it? And it had a lot of miles on it. And I said, well, I don't know, I'd probably put a timing chain in it if I was just trying to keep from having trouble with it, but there ain't nothing wrong with this truck. And so he went straight to the service manager. That man said, my truck needs a timing chain. I want a timing chain put in it under warranty because it had a lifetime warranty, you know, one of them 5-year things, unlimited mileage. And you can't fix something that ain't broke under warranty, you know what I'm saying? But I mean, I didn't know the guy was gonna do that. I mean, all he was doing was he was asking these loaded questions. And that's a lot of the times they don't like the customers that are milling around talking to the mechanics, you know. But anyway, and if one talks ugly to you, like sometimes they will, all you gotta do is walk away. Say, look, deal with this guy.